So I wanted to do a quick video as to what my favorite cameras are and why. There are certain features in all of these that I think stand out, at least to me they did. Um, I should preface this with a little note that the majority of these are no longer available new. You're going to need to get them used. There are a few that are available new, and I'll point those out as we go along. But unless I note, you should probably look on eBay or in a camera store that specializes in used cameras. Every single one of these cameras is going to have a large sensor in it compared to a compact, to a little point and shoot. And also, each of these is going to have at least some degree of manual control. The majority of them are going to be digital SLRs. There's going to be one rangefinder and one rangefinder-esque large sensor compact. With that out of the way, let's get started. So we have the Olympus E420. The 400, 410, and 420 were the smallest digital SLRs at the time they were out, especially with this 25mm 2.8 pancake mounted on here. Now these cameras used the 4/3 system, what has been adapted later on to micro 4/3, and there's a camera here in the lineup that has got my attention that we'll talk about that is a micro 4/3. Anyway, this was before micro 4/3. This is a standard 4/3 sensor, which means that this 25mm pancake has a standard view of 50 millimeters, which is from what I understand, what the human eye can see. Now, besides size, there was another thing that made this camera unique, and that had to be the menu system. You hit the OK button, you can arrow around, turn the dial to change settings. It was incredibly unique. Well, I don't know if it was unique, I'm sorry, because nowadays other cameras do the same. But it was the first instance that I saw of it. But it was easy, fast. Olympus continues it today in their pen lineup of micro 4/3 cameras. But anyway, the Olympus E400 series was my honest to goodness one of my favorites for that particular reason, the menu system and the fact that this thing was just so darn small. Another camera that was high on my list was the Panasonic Lumix DMC L1. Now this is a digital SLR. It looks like a rangefinder, but it's not. But the reason I love it is because of the manual controls. You've got your shutter speed here on the back, or on the top. You've got your aperture here on the lens itself. You've got a flash that has a bounce effect, and what that means is you release it once, and it'll sit at a 45-degree angle, and the idea is that the flash will bounce off the ceiling and down onto your subject. It makes it a lot easier than having the flash straight up in front of your eyes, not to mention a lot less painful. This camera also had live view, which nowadays practically every camera has live view, even the new Leica M420. But back then, back in 2006, when this was new, the live view was not so much a common attribute. It was just coming onto the scene for digital SLRs. Speaking of digital SLRs, the next camera that was on my favorites list was the Nikon D3000. And the reason the D3000 was on my list was I'm personally a manual shooter. I'll shoot in program, aperture, shutter, or full manual mode, but I will never shoot in automatic. There are a vast majority of people out there, though, who are using their smartphones to take pictures, who would want to advance their photography but are not sure how to do it. Maybe they've seen the pictures, but they have no idea how they're made. This camera, the Nikon D3000, introduced Nikon's guide system into their very low, their bottom of the line budget digital SLRs. Now, what is their guide system? You know how in Windows, when you go through and install a piece of software, you have an install wizard, and it takes you step by step through installing the software. This camera has has a mode. Again, it's called Guide. And what it does is it takes you through step by step, just like those installation wizards, to give you a very easy to follow um, list of instructions on how to do things like blurring waterfalls, uh, blurring the background in portraits, freezing action, things like that. And the main reason, like I said, the main reason this caught my eye was because of the guide mode. These days it's continued in the D3200. I'm sorry, 31, well, 31 and 3200. Next up, we have the Panasonic Lumix DMC G1. Remember I talked to you about the 4/3 sensor back on the Olympus? This is the micro 4/3, the world's first micro 4/3 camera, the DMC G1. It was the first camera to take a DSLR size sensor and interchangeable lenses, excuse me, and bring them into a much more compact form factor for the mass market. Now I say for the mass market because there's one camera on this list that is an interchangeable lens camera with a DSLR sensor, but that one is not a mass market item. It is a very sought after enthusiast item that is actually sought after for the brand more than anything. Well, we'll get there. Anyway, so the Lumix DMC G1 was the world's first micro four thirds body, and it started what we know now as the mirrorless cameras. And I honestly think is one of the reasons it's my favorite is because of the way the control layout was set up. This lever here, drive mode, exposure mode. Let's see, what was this one? Autofocusing. So it was not bad at all. This camera was the world's well, not the world's first, but the first compact camera that with a DSLR sensor that I've ever seen. But it also is on my list for being comically slow. I mean, this thing, keep in mind, this particular unit, the DP1, it's been succeeded by the DP1 Merrill. The DP1 is no longer available. As I said, if it was available, I would tell you. Anyway, this thing is comically slow. It takes like 5 seconds to power up. It takes longer than that to record its images. The average consumer would consider the fixed lens focal length a negative, but I personally don't. And the reason is because it forces you to get up and move and actually look at your composition from a whole different angle. So the average consumer might consider this a downside, but this camera is not aimed at the average consumer. In fact, the only camera so far on this list that I would say is aimed at the average consumer, and by average consumer I mean somebody who's upgrading to their very first digital SLR from a compact, those cameras would be the E400 series and also the D3000. And the reason I give those two priority was because of the Olympus's size and the Nikon's ease of use. But the DP1 is not, like I said, it's not meant for the average consumer. But let me tell you something: unless you shoot landscapes, I mean, this is not an action camera by any means. This thing is just slow. That was the main reason it was on my list, because it was just a laughing stock if you were after speed. From there, we move on to the Fuji X100, which has been since usurped by the X100S. The main thing behind this camera, like the Panasonic L1, it's got the control layout that I personally love. It's a very minimalist approach. You've got your shutter speed up here, your exposure compensation over here. With this function and a rear dial, you can change your ISO. and on this ring you can adjust your aperture. I mean, it's incredibly easy to work with. This is again another enthusiast level compact with a DSLR size sensor. But let me tell you something. The big thing behind this camera is the hybrid viewfinder. This has both an optical viewfinder, and if you flip this switch, then it puts up a curtain where you can't see through to the back, and you essentially get an electronic viewfinder. So it's a two-in-one arrangement, and that atop, in addition to the image quality. Now, all of these cameras produce image quality that is miles ahead of the average compact. So I'm not necessarily addressing image quality much in these videos. In this video, I'm sorry, but no, this particular camera, the control layout and the hybrid viewfinder are what stood out for me with the X100 and the X100S. The X100S, by the way, is available at this time. This camera, I think it's still available, but I can't be sure. You'd have to check Leica's website. This is a Leica M monochrome. What was unique about this camera? Well, first of all, it's expensive. It's around six, 7, 8 grand. It is a true rangefinder. And from what I understand, you don't look through the lens like you would on a digital SLR. What you have to do is you have to line up the images in the viewfinder. Essentially, you have to line up a square with the image you're going to take, and that essentially tells you when it's in focus. Keep in mind that I've not shot with this particular camera, so I couldn't tell you. I'm honestly very, very curious as to whether or not I'll be able to use a rangefinder myself. Now, the X100 that I just showed you is not a true rangefinder. It's just a rangefinder styled compact with minimalist controls and a DSLR sensor inside. This one, by the way, those DSLR sensors, by the way, are APS-C size with the exception of the 4/3 bodies and possibly the DP1. I believe that one is also a 4/3. This one, though, is a full frame 35mm sensor. Now, what else is unique? Well, you notice that in the beginning I called this the Leica M monochrome. There's a reason for that. This thing has no white balance. It has no JPEG compression. This camera only will shoot black and white RAW files, which, if you're willing to put in the time and effort, this thing produces truly phenomenal images. But apparently black and white images, from what I understand, are extremely hard to process, much harder than a color image would be. But to be honest, if you're in the market and you've got the money and you've got the time, this is, from what I understand, I've seen reviews and I've seen the images this thing can come up with. I have no words. Now, of course, again, this is $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And remember I told you earlier about the branding? This camera does produce incredibly, like I said, it produces incredibly wonderful images, but at the same time, you're also paying for the Leica brand. You know, Leica is like the Rolls-Royce of cameras. Now, this is the same control scheme, shutter speed up here, aperture on the ring, aperture ring on the lens, as the Panasonic Lumix L1 and the Fuji that I've showed you. But again, this one has a full frame sensor, and the fact that it shoots black and white, I think, is an extremely unique attribute. But that's why it's one of my favorites. I've never shot with the old film cameras, but from what I understand, this is sort of a throwback to those days, which I like. I like unique things like that, where old is new again. The very last camera on this list is another Leica. This is the S2. This thing has what they call a medium format sensor. Now, the medium format sensor cameras are expensive. Do you want to know how expensive? Well, let's put it this way. You could get a nicely equipped Chevrolet Cruze for the price of this camera. $22,000. $100,000, and that's without a lens. The lens, I believe this particular lens mounted here, $6 grand. So not cheap in the least, but you get what you pay for. This is another very minimalist a camera, and for the price, you know, this is primarily touted at those who make hundreds of thousands of dollars from their photographs. This thing is completely weather sealed. On the back, it has a sapphire crystal cover for the LCD. But the biggest thing for this, as I understand, is the medium format sensor. The medium format sensors would be used to print like billboard-sized photos. You know those photos that you see on street signs, on those street billboard ads, for instance? I wouldn't be at all surprised if this is the kind of camera that they use to print this. But the big thing that stuck out for me about this camera, again, was its price. Now, since then, I've seen cameras that are around that price range, but still, 22 grand. This is the first camera that I've ever seen with that price tag. But these are essentially my personal favorites, and why they are my personal favorites. And again, they all have features that stand out. Now, compared to a compact, they all produce excellent image quality. This one is, the image sensor is a lot bigger than a full frame digital SLR, and it's obviously bigger than the Leica M. But you know, you get what you pay for. But what do you guys think? What, out of this list, what would you say your favorite is? Is your favorite even on this list? But what do you guys, what's your take? Thank you for watching. Comments are welcome, and have a nice day.